Thank you everyone. Thank you everyone so much for coming. As you know, Mr. Bercow has a very prolific career in politics, and he's most famously known for his role as the ex-House of Commons Speaker.
We will have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So will you please join us in welcoming John Bercow.
Bora, Claire, all members of the school community, the leadership of the school, and anybody else who happens to have wandered into this room/lecture theatre either deliberately or by unfortunate accident, I want very warmly to welcome you and to thank you for, at this early stage of the proceedings at any rate, so generously welcoming me. I'm going to begin with what is perhaps not quite an habitual, but almost an habitual and certainly a customary question that I tend to pose in these circumstances, looking at a gentleman in the back row with hands clasped together. Sir, can you hear me at the back? Yes. You can. I'm extraordinarily, indeed inordinately grateful to you for signalling that you can, and moreover, for doing so with what might be said to constitute a beatific smile on your face, suggesting that at this early stage of the proceedings, at any rate, you are not altogether distraught about the fact that you can hear me. You're not veritably crying into your soup, or as far as I can discern, proposing within a matter of seconds to depart the lecture theatre. So you might think that I should quit while I'm ahead, but I'm afraid I don't intend to do so. That would be something of a cheapskate operation on my part to turn up and then immediately go. I'm delighted you can hear me, and what I want also to say to you, sir, having embarrassed you quite considerably already by my identification of you, is that your response, that you can hear me, and that you don't seem too distressed about it, represents a very marked improvement upon the last occasion, students, on which I posed that self-same question to an audience, can you hear me at the back, in which some unhelpful wag replied, yes, but I will happily change places with someone who can't. So the fact that you can hear me and aren't too sad is an advance in my mind and a positive tick on the score sheet of Tiffin School, if such a tick were needed, which it has to be said, say I segueing into the issue of Tiffin School, is rather doubtful. You don't really need any further ticks in any box, because the school is as outstanding an example of state education as is to be found anywhere in the capital, and almost certainly, on the basis of the factual evidence, by comparison with almost anywhere in the country. You do education here at its highest level, focusing on the individual, nurturing talent, encouraging excellence, but also recognizing that excellence comes in very different forms for and with and as part of different students. As I can discern it from my own limited and fairly recent acquaintance with the school, the culture here is to work hard and play hard. Work hard in the academic sense, but also play hard, which is a form of work hard in so many other aspects of the school/youth experience. It's not just about those exam results, of quintessential importance though they are, and prerequisites, I'm afraid they have to be regarded as being for so much of what you want to achieve, but it's also a question of nourishing and, if you will, if you don't mind me comparing you with a fruit, extracting every last bit of juice from your respective oranges in terms of post-school activity, extracurricular focus. And it doesn't really matter what it is, It might be something of an intellectual character, it might be sporting, it might be artistic, it might be creative as in media, journalism, starting a newspaper, a story I heard about on a recent visit to the school, somebody who'd newly arrived and wanted to get stuck in and was interested in journalism and thought, well, how about getting involved with the student newspaper, only to discover that there was none such. Well, in that case, thought the said student, with encouragement from your magnificent staff, I will establish such a newspaper. And it's that can-do mindset which I think distinguishes the school and makes it, I'm sure you will all agree and be experiencing, a very special phenomenon to be a student at this school, possibly at any stage during the school experience, and perhaps in the most acute and extended form for those who pursue their studies through the sixth form. Now, I do want to talk to you, as you would expect, about politics, because that was my career, but just before I do, I want to treat of one quite sensitive matter, Cora and Claire, which I have not disclosed to you, and has not therefore been the subject of discussion, which I think your natural courtesy will probably disincline you to raise with me directly, but which, if unaddressed, will lurk mischievously, and perhaps from my vantage point, perilously in the undergrowth, and which I conclude therefore must be knocked on the head at the outset before I further proceed. And that, dear students of Tiffin School, is the sensitive and delicate matter of height. Very specifically, it has been bruited. I'm not an expert in, but I am a fan of the English language, and I've always loved that rather old-fashioned, almost antediluvian word, bruited. It has been bruited, put about, in some of the more down-market parts of the press. I should say, by the way, that I use the term press with a degree of creative or linguistic, journalistic, perhaps, license, because it's principally the Daily Fail that I have in mind, that I am the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Now, students, I want to say to you, in this very proper age of respect for all and non-discrimination, that there is nothing wrong with being short. Indeed, upon the law of averages, the great likelihood is that a statistically significant proportion of you in this audience share with me the characteristic of vertical challenge. I know not to whom this characteristic applies, because you are overwhelmingly seated, but I rather imagine that it is so. And I want to say, we short people should stick together. We may be short, but we may also be, and regard ourselves as being, perfectly formed, and I say, with insistence and without fear of contradiction, that we are environmentally friendly in the sense that we do not absorb much space. So, that's by way of a disclaimer. There's nothing wrong with being short. I do not want to be accused of heightism, or even celebrating heightism. There's nothing wrong with being short, but there is everything wrong with historical inaccuracy. And it's quite wrong when some of these more down-market, low-musical, fifth-rate scribblers on the Daily Fail say, oh, well, Bercow's the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Students, you will, I'm sure, as academic exemplars, be as keen on historical accuracy as I am. It's quite wrong when they say that. Sir John Bussey, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, from 1394 to 1398, Sir John Wenlock, Speaker of the UK House of Commons from 1455 to 1456, and Sir Thomas Tresham, Speaker of the UK House of Commons in 1459, are all believed to have been shorter than I am, although I do have to admit that this was true only after all three of them had been beheaded. Indeed, no fewer than 7 of my predecessors as Speaker met their end on the executioner's block, One was killed in battle, and a further poor unfortunate soul was brutally murdered. So this did underline for me the significance of the office I held, and the fact that whatever the woes and challenges which afflicted and confronted me, I was not likely to suffer that fate. I was not likely to lose my head, although I must confess that towards the end there was a growing queue of people who seemed quite ready to subject me to that fate. But on the whole, I knew, well, whatever else happens, I shall survive. I'm not going to lose my head, and it's a great privilege to serve the House as Speaker. And it is substantially about that matter, perhaps inevitably, that I will say something today. But before I do, let me just utter one further and last set of preliminaries. I asked what would be the makeup of today's audience, and I was told that it was open pretty much to any student who wanted to come, so there will be people here studying politics, no doubt, but you will be a very small minority, I imagine, of the total cohort. And therefore, although obviously I am interested in, perhaps even passionate about the calling, the career in which I served for 2.5 decades as a politician, a member of Parliament, and for just over a decade as Speaker, I don't take it for granted that everybody else is. And indeed, I'm not so out of touch with the state of public opinion as to be unconscious of the contempt with which politics and politicians are often regarded. So I want just not really to counter that wholesale, and I simply wouldn't be able to do so in a couple of sentences or even paragraphs, but to try to place the matter in context as follows. Why should you care about, why should you bother with politics at all? The first answer is that for all our trials and tribulations, faults and failings, minor flaws, i.e. peccadillos, and major flaws, glaring gaps in service delivery and levels of public dissatisfaction with the political process, the fact is that the UK is a democracy. And I do think it is a case, as somebody once said, of at least 2 cheers for democracy. It doesn't mean that you always get the right decisions. I think I can point to a number of examples in public debate in recent years in which democratic decisions have nevertheless been wrong decisions for the country. But there is an inherent virtue and value in a democratic system. And in essence, it can be summarized thus. In a democracy, and this will apply to some of you already if you've turned 18, and to others of you who do so before very long, you can choose who represents you, and at least as importantly as that, you can change your choice over a period. If either you have changed your mind, your values are different, your priorities are new, or the person whom you once thought best suited to represent you as a local councillor or as a member of Parliament is no longer suitably equipped to represent you. And that concept of democracy being much more than and distinguishable from one person, one vote, once, is very important. I say that because there are countries around the world which will call themselves democracies, which aren't, but in which there was at one time a democratic election. And that's true on a number of different continents around the world, and it's been true during a number of different historical periods. That there's been a maelstrom of activity, there's been competitivity between different points of view, there's been an election, and someone has won. A party's got into office and someone has emerged as Prime Minister or President, as the case may be. But thereafter, there's not been another opportunity for a democratic vote. Well, for all the ills of our system, I don't think anybody is seriously supposing that that's going to happen here anytime soon. It doesn't mean that one should be complacent about the danger posed by threats from extremists, but that isn't a current threat that we face. I will offer you all sorts of views about Rishi Sunak and his government if you're interested in hearing them, but one thing I can tell you for certain is Sunak knows that there has to be an election, in all likelihood by the end of 2024. I think legally he can call the election as late as the very early part, I think January of 2025, but it would have to be called in December and held in January. There is no escaping that. So there is an opportunity for people who voted last time and want to vote the same again to do so. There's an opportunity for people who voted Conservative last time to vote differently next time, and there's an opportunity, of course, for new voters to vote for the first time. That concept of a democracy is very important. The second reason why I think politics matters is that whether you like it or not, whether it interests you or not, whether it's top of your list of priorities or not, and it isn't for most people, I readily accept, is not the major interest of most people, it will affect you. It will affect you. And I say that, I'm sorry if I sound rather didactic and bossy almost in saying that, but I say that not on the basis of bad experience of student gatherings, on the basis of people in my own constituency, where I was a member of Parliament for 22 years, sometimes saying, oh, Mr. Bercow, I'm bound to say, I'm really not very interested in the election, and I don't intend to vote. And I would say, well, I'm sorry to hear that, sir, but if you're not intending to vote, you obviously won't complain about the result, because I'm not. And in my experience, people who said that almost invariably did complain subsequently, which, to be fair, they had a democratic right to do, but it was sometimes on the tip of my tongue to say, well, you were the one who couldn't be bothered to vote. And I didn't tend to say that because I think a member of Parliament has to rise above that and just try to be a good representative. I admit to you, and I say this with particular reference to girls here present, that I found it particularly upsetting and sometimes almost a bit discombobulating on the doorsteps if I met a female who said, well, I'm not going to vote, I'm really not very interested, and it's not going to affect me. And I thought, gosh, the suffragettes went through hell and to hell and back to get the right for women to vote. And it seems such a pity in a world in which there are still very large numbers of women who can't vote and who are discriminated against and abused, raped, tortured, incarcerated or killed, that they should have people of their gender saying, well, I can't be bothered. It does actually matter, and it will affect you. And sometimes people say, well, it won't really affect me because they're all the same. Well, they're not all the same. They're not all the same. The political parties may disappoint, you may think they're not good enough, but they're not the same. We could always come on to that later in questions if you want. The idea that Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party is indistinguishable from Keir Starmer's Labour Party is not a credible proposition. There are important differences between them on economic policy, on housing policy, on immigration policy, on a range of other policies to boot. And the makeup of those parties, not least in the House of Commons, is quite sharply different. And if you are in a position to vote, you'll have to make a judgment as to whether you want one or other of those parties, or whether you prefer to vote for a third party, of which the Liberal Democrats in England is the most obvious example, or to vote Green, or for some other party. But we can come on to that in due course if you like. For my part, I am, I suppose, something of an exotic beast in the Westminster village, in the sense that I got elected to the House in 1997. I wasn't the quintessential, typical Tory MP that you found over generations, and was even commonplace when I was elected in 1997. In other words, I wasn't from either an aristocratic background or an affluent middle or upper middle class background. I wasn't privately educated, I didn't serve in the armed forces, I hadn't been an entrepreneur. So I wasn't altogether typical. I was a state school boy. I was educated at Finchley Manor Hill School, which is now I think called the Compton School in Somers Lane in North London. I went to Essex University, a decent university, but not one of the great universities. I studied government, I worked in merchant banking for a short period, and then I worked in the public relations industry. for some years, and I ended up as a director of the company where I worked, and then I left the private sector and worked very briefly in government in the 1990s for Conservative cabinet ministers, of whom the best known was Ken Clarke, who went on to become Chancellor of the Exchequer. Ken was my boss at the Treasury in the mid-1990s. I must admit, always have a desire from the age of about 15 or 16, one day to be a Member of Parliament. And partly because I thought the government of James Callaghan, who was the Labour Prime Minister in the late 70s, was a very poor quality government. And partly because at the time I was impressed by the Conservative leadership of Margaret Thatcher. I went to school in her constituency. I became a Conservative. I think I was also influenced by my late father, who was very Conservative-minded. And so that's how I came to develop a Conservative corpus of belief, if you will. And I decided that one day I'd like to be a Member of Parliament. I was in Parliament for just over 2 decades, but I did a slightly unusual thing. It's often said that as people get older, they become more conservative. I'm not sure that this thesis is supported by any academic evidence. I do a little bit of teaching, amongst all sorts of other things I do. I do a little bit of teaching at Royal Holloway College, London University, and there's an academic there who actually specialises in the study of how people's views evolve. And a while ago, she said to me, John, it's not actually supported by the academic evidence. The evidence is that people become more of what they've tended always to be as they get older. But anecdotally, let me put it like that, not academically, but anecdotally, we can probably all think of examples, or maybe young people would struggle to do so, but older people can certainly think of examples of people they know who were once quite left-wing, usually when they were younger, and who became more right-wing, i.e. less socialistic and perhaps less liberal and more conservative as they got older. Well, I suppose I'm an odd case. I was rather an intense right-wing young man, I think partly influenced by my late father, who was very, very conservative. And I have become much more liberal and left-inclined as I have got older. If you were to say to me, well, John, what do you actually believe? I think I would summarise it for you by saying I think that the evidence around the world is compelling, is conclusive, that free enterprise systems, that is to say systems characterised by the private sector generating wealth through business activity, are more successful at generating growth and living standards advances than are the command economies of this world. So the United States is an extreme example of capitalism, but the United States and Britain, for that matter, have been more successful at generating growth and advancing living standards than the command economies of the Soviet Union as was and Cuba, to give you just a couple of examples. Those command economies, those top-down economies that try to run everything from the centre and don't really believe in private enterprise at all, have on the whole been frankly colossal, catastrophic economic failures. So I do believe in the free enterprise system, but there is a but. There is a but. And that is that if you were to have a completely undiluted free enterprise system where everything is just left to the private sector, you would have a very cruel society in which some people would do incredibly well and become enormously prosperous and very successful in defending themselves, and other people, frankly, would barely get by at all. And to a degree, I don't want to exaggerate it, but to a degree, that is true in the United States. There are people who struggle to get by, and because in the United States they don't have an advanced socialised healthcare system of the kind that we have in the UK, there are people who are petrified of getting ill in America, because if they get ill, they can't get healthy again, because they can't afford to pay the bills. And that is a pretty savage state of affairs. So I believe in free enterprise, but I also believe that you have to have some government control of business so that it doesn't get completely out of hand, so that it operates according to some decent standards in terms of environmental respect and health and safety and proper working conditions and respect for the rights of part-time workers and people who are wanting leave from because they're pregnant or whatever it may be. And I also think that the evidence is that you have to have public services. You have to have great public services which are principally financed by the government. And that means health, education, but it also means a decent transport infrastructure. These things aren't going to happen if you just leave it to the private sector. They are things that need to be government-led, government-sponsored, government-regulated, and government-financed. And I think that around the world also the evidence is that although right-of-centre forces have by and large won the argument on economics, I think I would go so far as to say that left-of-centre forces have won the argument on the battle for equality. Equality of people of different genders, equality for people of different races, equality for people of different sexual orientations, etc., etc., etc. The equality argument has largely been won by people from the left. And most people, I think, you'll tell me if you disagree, I think most people would say, certainly I believe very strongly, that the gap between the haves, that is to say people who are fairly prosperous, and the have-nots, does matter. It does matter. Because around the world, those societies in which the gap between the relatively well-off and the relatively poor is a smaller gap, tend to have lower rates of crime, they have lower levels of suicide, they have lower incidences of mental health failure, etc. So those Scandinavian countries are perhaps a good example of where, of course, there are wealthy people and there are some relatively poor people, but there is a greater focus on trying to achieve some sort of semblance of fairness, of equality, and of accompanying community cohesion. Whereas there is much lesser focus on that in the United States. And if you looked at places in Latin America where there are sometimes very sharp divides between wealthy people and poor people, it's a pretty savage divide between the prosperous and the not prosperous. So that's where I'm coming from, for what it's worth. I myself didn't want to be a government minister. I didn't think I would be a very good government minister. And I was fairly convinced that I wouldn't be asked by successive Conservative leaders to be a government minister. You may remember a man called David Cameron, who's just recently come back into government after quite a long gap, and is now the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, the noble Lord Cameron. Well, Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party for many years, and I could see that he was likely to become Prime Minister in 2010, which, sure enough, he did. And I had calculated some years before that A, I didn't wish to serve as a minister under him. I didn't, I'm afraid to say, have a particularly high regard for him. I'm sure it was heartily reciprocated in terms of his attitude to me, but I didn't think that he was an ideal Prime Minister, and I didn't think I was very likely to be asked to be a minister. And so around 2004, I decided, well, I enjoy being a Member of Parliament, pursuing my own causes. I had moved somewhat to the centre by then, and my main interests were special educational needs provision, the fight against global poverty, constitutional reform, LGBT equality. I'm a straight man who for somewhat over 2 decades has been a strong supporter of gay equality. I spoke on the House in the matter as long ago as I think February 2000, 23 and a half years ago. Against the majority opinion in my own party, I argued for an equal age of consent between heterosexuals and gays. So I was, by the early noughties, a pretty liberal-minded Tory. I didn't think I was likely to be a minister under Cameron. I didn't want to be. And of course, eventually, you have to decide what to do in Parliament. You can try to be a minister, or you can decide to be a backbencher, or you can think of another route. And I said to my wife, well, I enjoy being a backbencher, but I would quite like the opportunity at some stage to do something else. So I think I'll have a go at the role of Speaker, which makes you a kind of umpire, if the opportunity arises. Ah, the lights have gone out on us, but the lights are back. Now that might have been a technological quirk, or it might be something leading on. It doesn't matter, the lights have returned. So I decided, well, I will have a go at the role of Speaker if the opportunity exists, and I did have a go at the role of Speaker. And when I stood in 2009, there were 10 candidates for Speaker, and I was fortunate to emerge from the pack. I think most people know that the Speaker is an umpire who keeps order, encourages people to take part, tries to cut down on the number of people excluded altogether as a result of bad behaviour. And that was my responsibility. And I intended to discharge it to the best of my ability, and I did for just over 10 years, being elected and re-elected as Speaker a total of 4 times, which may be the longest. Going to bring about some change in this place. With your support, I will be a change maker. And fundamentally, students, I wanted to change things in 3 ways. First, in the chamber, I thought progress at question time was absurdly slow, with a lot of very long questions and long non-answers. And I said, look, I think this is really bad for the House. There are lots of members who don't bother turning up if their question is on the list, but it's lower than about number 10. Because they just think they won't be reached in the time available, and that's a real drag on chamber activity and very bad for the standing of the House and frankly for the morale of MPs. I said I'm determined to get down what we call the order paper, the list of questions for the day, so I will proceed at a brisker pace. Now the evidence is that I did. I increased the number of questions that were allowed by somewhere between a quarter and a third over the 10 years I was in office. So we got through a lot more. That doesn't mean the questions were necessarily better. That's a matter for the member posing the question, not for the speaker. But what I was really doing is saying, look, this place is for members of the House to question, to probe, to scrutinise, to challenge, to contradict, to expose the errors or omission or commission of the government of the day. That's what MPs are there to do. And I'm not going to tolerate a situation in which ministers just prattle on at great length and deliberately, as they have been doing, they deliberately crowd out later questions that they're going to find awkward. And that won't happen if I become Speaker. And I think the evidence is it didn't. I remember on one occasion when David Cameron himself launched into a very lengthy non-answer to a question. And I must admit, I was impatient and I thought, well, he's already spent ages not answering the question. He then said, now, Mr. Speaker, I want to focus. No, he said, I know the opposition don't want to hear it. I want to focus on Deborah Mattinson's book about the 2010 election campaign, which got nothing to do with what he'd been asked. Deborah Mattinson is a Labour pollster, and she'd written a book basically saying my advice wasn't followed and Labour lost. And David Cameron wanted to read from this book and torment Ed Miliband and so on. It was all no doubt great old Etonian fun from his point of view, but it got nothing to do with what he'd been asked. And so I said, order! We're not getting into that. And Cameron said to me in response, it's on YouTube if it interests you, Cameron said to me, but Mr. Speaker, I haven't finished. And I said, well, in response to that question, the Prime Minister can take it from me that he has finished and he must resume his seat. And he didn't like it. Well, I'm afraid, tough was my attitude. And then on another occasion, he came out at the end, again having given rather long non-answers. And he had a go at me saying, because I'd let question time run on a few minutes. I did that, students, so that more colleagues had the chance to question it. And as Cameron came out, he said to me, Mr. Speaker, I would just remind you that I have got a plane to catch. To which obviously I replied by saying, yes, I understand that, Prime Minister, but with the very greatest of respect, it is your plane. It's your plane. It's not going to go without you. So, you know, if your plane has to leave 5 minutes later, so what? So that was my approach, and I did say when I stood for office, in this chamber, if there are matters of urgent importance that need to be raised with ministers, I will give members the opportunity to raise those issues through what we call urgent, capital U, questions, capital Q. My predecessor, for reasons with which I won't bore you now, I can happily answer questions about this, my predecessor as Speaker, Michael Martin, didn't like granting urgent questions. The government didn't like having urgent questions because they were a bit awkward and unpredictable. And Michael very rarely granted them. The year before I was elected Speaker, he granted 2 in the whole 12-month period. This was the period of terrorist activities and the global financial crisis. So it wasn't as though nothing important or urgent was happening, but Michael, my predecessor, had an honourable, but in my view mistaken, bias against urgent questions. I said, if you elect me, we will have urgent questions when there are urgent occasions. And I granted 685 over 10 years. Well, that was not because I was saying the government was wrong or right. I was Speaker mainly during the periods of the Conservative government, but when I was first elected, it was a Labour government. Nothing to do with what colour government, nothing to do with the merit of the issue in terms of government policy. My judgment was, does this matter need to be aired in the chamber today? And if the answer was yes, I would grant it. And the minister would have to abandon whatever he or she was doing and come to the chamber and answer. So those were quite significant chamber changes that I made. I also resolved that because the House was a very antiquated place, magnificent in its own way, architecturally striking, very beautiful and so on, but because it was very old-fashioned, I wanted to modernise the House outside the chamber. What do I mean? Students who might be sitting there thinking, what on earth John got in mind? Well, let me give you an example. We had a shooting gallery in Parliament where you could go pistol shooting in a particular room if you wished to do so. It was a minority sport. But there was nowhere that we had a nursery. We did not have a nursery where MPs or staff could place young children, essentially babies or toddlers, in order to improve their work-life balance so that they could carry on doing their jobs but make sure that their children were safe. And to me, that was a nonsense. A modern parliament ought, frankly, to have a nursery. I didn't think we really needed a shooting gallery, we certainly needed a nursery. I had the mother and father of all battles to establish a nursery with all sorts of, frankly, fossilised objections being raised, but eventually I found a site. I had an official telling me there was no site. It was a frightfully good idea in principle, Mr. Speaker, but in practice it can't be done. Why not? I said, and he said, no suitable site. No suitable site. No suitable site, sir, I'm afraid. It's frightfully unfortunate, but I'm afraid there's no suitable site where you can put a nursery. And I said, well, I don't believe that. And in the end, I established a nursery, but it was on a site where there'd previously been a bar, which apparently some researchers used to use. And so there was a campaign to stop me in my tracks and stop this facility being built on the grounds that it would mean that this was a bar where people could no longer drink. Well, as my parliamentary colleague Tom Watson, who I think is now in the House of Lords, Lord Watson, as Tom Watson said at the time, this is a ridiculous objection to Mr. Speaker's plan. The fact is, there is a vast number of places on the parliamentary estate where you can get a beer, but there's nowhere you can put a baby. And as for the government whip's office saying, oh, well, people can put their babies in the whip's office during a vote. You know, if they've nowhere else to put their children, they can put them in the whip's office to be looked after there. I mean, that is frankly an obscene suggestion, students. I must tell you that there is very considerable doubt about the suitability of a whip's office to cope with the mentality of strong-minded and occasionally over-emotional adults. So the idea that a whip's office can be expected to cope with little infants crawling around the room is absurd. It is a skill, it's an expertise, and they need to be properly looked after. Anyway, the nursery is now very successful and thriving. So I wanted to establish a digital, high-tech, interactive, state-of-the-art education centre in Parliament that would show people the journey from the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 to the modern democracy we are today, which could be visited by 100,000 additional young people every year. I had objections to that, principally from the House of Lords, on the grounds that it was going to be situated next to them. Well, that was the architectural and engineering advice that I had as the most suitable location for that centre. But there were people who tried to block that. And at one point, a very senior official said to me, Mr. Speaker, the House of Commons is on your side on the matter of the education centre. The House of Lords is very, very strongly opposed to you, sir. You've got a choice. Do you want to proceed with a considerable kerfuffle with the Lords, or would you prefer to put the matter on the back burner and we can try to build support over a period. And I must tell you, students, in life you sometimes just have to make instinctive decisions, and I just instinctively felt I am not putting this off. I'm not going to put this off. If I put this on the back burner, it won't be on the back burner for a year or two. It will be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. It may never get built. So I said to the official concerned, who was very properly raising the matter with me, I said, no, we will go ahead, and if I have to battle it out with the Lords, so be it. And he said, well, it's a bit worse than that, Mr. Speaker. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the Lords are making it clear that if you go ahead, they won't pay their share. They won't pay their share of the cost. And I said, well, I know what the cost is. The cost can be financed from the House of Commons account, from the House of Commons funds. And I said, it means it's more expensive than if the Lords were bearing their share of the burden. But if that's the game they want to play, so be it. I'm not going to be financially blackmailed into dropping this very sensible plan. Anyway, we went ahead, and the rest is history. That facility now operates. And ironically, quite a lot of the Lords who were so strongly opposed have since come round. So I'm simply making the point, you sometimes just have to do what you think is right, and take care of the situation as best you can. I appointed several people to senior positions who were either the first female or the second female to be appointed to such positions. And I appointed the first female and BAME Speaker's Chaplain, the person who conducts daily prayer services in the House, in the history of the House. That person is a woman called the Right Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, who is now Justin Welby's deputy in Canterbury. She's the Bishop of Dover. And that, to be honest, is the proudest appointment I made. I absolutely felt in my bones that Rose was the right person to appoint. The church establishment were against her, and there were a number of quite senior people in the House of Commons, who didn't want me to go ahead with the appointment because it was going to upset the church establishment. I will be absolutely honest with you, students. I didn't give a flying flamingo what the church establishment thought. And you may think, wow, isn't that very arrogant of you? I don't think so. I wasn't interested in the church establishment. I couldn't care less about them. I was concerned about the House of Commons. And I thought Rose would be a brilliant, warm, empathetic, charming, learning, inspirational Speaker's Chaplain. And so she proved to be. We worked together for 9 years, but I could just have given up and thought, oh, it's not worth having a row. So I did have quite a lot of rows in my turn in office, but as somebody once said afterwards, somebody who worked with me, he said, I worked with the Speaker for a decade, and he said he was very clear from the start that he had a reform agenda, and he said, all I can say as somebody who supported him from start to finish is the Speaker, in order to get his way, did pick a number of fights, and he won most of them. And I think I would say that. I didn't win them all. I now and again had to concede on particular matters, and I didn't get my way, but most of the time I got my way. And I conclude by saying to you, the last example relates to the Youth Parliament, with which some of you may be familiar. The Youth Parliament is a very well-established institution that operates throughout the year, but in particular meets once a year for debates in Westminster, in the chamber of the House of Commons, on a non-sitting Friday. In other words, a day when we wouldn't otherwise meet. And I voted for the Youth Parliament to have the right to debate in Westminster. There was quite a strong body of opinion, in my opinion, rather reactionary opinion, against the idea. But those of us who wanted the Youth Parliament to have the right to sit in Westminster won. And that was determined at the beginning of 2009. A few months later, I was elected Speaker. And I was told that the Youth Parliament in October that year was to be chaired by the Deputy Speaker, Sir Alan Hazelhurst, who was a very well-regarded Deputy Speaker, my deputy by then. And I said, oh, how so? Why is Alan chairing? I intend to chair. And I was told, well, sir, your predecessor, who was very much Scotland-based, didn't like being in London on a Friday. He liked being back in Glasgow, which was totally understandable and tolerable. And so Michael Martin, my predecessor, had said to Sir Alan, Alan, you chair the debates of the Parliament. And this had been agreed. Well, I didn't want that. I thought, no, A, I want to do it, and I admit the stimulation of chairing the debates appealed to me. And B, I thought, well, as a leader, I ought to set an example. I voted for this. I want this to happen. I want these young people to feel welcomed encouraged, supported, championed. And so I will chair. So I told Alan Hazelhurst he could take the day off with his Saffron Walden constituency or whatever, spend his time as he wished. I would chair. I had a florid of face, puce, elderly Conservative MP, now retired, coming up to me, flecks of spittle coming from his mouth to my face, saying, "Mr. Speaker, I am advised that you intend to dignify the proceedings of the UK Youth Parliament, to which, sir, I remind you, I am inveterately opposed with your presence in the chair." Well, students, I must say, was I aware, and did I need to be reminded, that this chap had been opposed to the proceedings of the Youth Parliament? No. Anybody within a 50-mile radius of the House of Commons would have been aware for some considerable number of months of the opposition of the Honourable Gentleman to the meeting of the UK Youth Parliament, because he had said so with great force and at very considerable length in the debate that had taken place in the House. And I said, no, I'm well aware of your opposition, but I don't see why you're quite so angry about me chairing. And he said, it's bad enough that it's taking place, but if you invest it with the significance of your high office, Mr. Speaker, that is a great deal worse. And I said to him, why? You're almost out of control. Why are you so worked up? I know what I'm talking about, sir. He said, I've been here a very great deal longer than you have. And I said, yeah, I know exactly how long you've been here. I know when you were elected in your by-election in 1971. That's not the issue. The issue is, why should it be such a disaster? And you know what he said? I've remembered this ever since, and I will remember it to my dying day, as emblematic of some people's reactionary, and certainly his reactionary opinions. He said, you mark my words, Mr. Speaker, if those young people come and speak in this chamber, dignified by your presence and encouragement in the chair, at the very least, chewing gum will be left all over the chamber. And at the worst, he said, penknives will be used and damage will be inflicted on these benches, which I love. And I said to him, I defend your right to your view, but I frankly don't defend your gratuitous abuse of the members of the Youth Parliament. I think that is frankly intolerable, that you should caricature, demonise and vilify them in that way. I make 3 predictions to you. They will be proud to come to the House, they will speak well, and they will behave a damn sight better than we do. And if I may say so, students, I was right on all 3 counts. So the Youth Parliament is now a very established fixture in Westminster, but it had to be fought for against those sorts of antediluvian, reactionary, Neanderthal attitudes. So my approach was to do what I thought was right, and I admit that I ran into trouble now and again. I made enemies, I upset people from time to time, but I didn't want to be Speaker just so I could say to my wife and kids, I was the Speaker of the House. I wanted to be Speaker to try to bring about change, to make the place more lively, more entertaining, more disputatious, more challenging, more empowering for the legislature, MPs, rather than the government of the day. I wanted it to be more modern. You know, I thought it was important that staff should be promoted on merit, not on the basis of background or gender or class. I thought it was important that we should have a decent nursery, that we should have an education facility, that we should support the Youth Parliament, and so on. So that was my approach. I have no plans to die tomorrow, but if I were to die tomorrow, I would die happy, feeling that I have been very lucky. And with that, you will be delighted and indeed relieved beyond words, students, to know that my speech is now definitively at an end.
We have about 5 minutes for questions at the end, so if anyone...
Quite quick.
Yeah.
At the end of your time as Speaker of the House, there had been a 230-year kind of streak of Speakers of the House getting granted peerage in the House of Lords. You weren't given this. Why do you think that is, and what do you make of it?
I don't lose any sleep over it. You're quite right. The tradition has tended to be that the Commons Speaker is given a peerage at the end. I think there were two factors against me. One was that the Conservative government was furiously hostile to me over the Brexit matter, and Boris Johnson very specifically said to me in October 2019 that he thought he would have a huge revolt on his hands, on his side, which is what he was concerned about, if he elevated me to the House of Lords. He said that to me. He told me that he wasn't going to nominate me for the Lords. And I said, well, you know, that's up to you, Prime Minister. I didn't stand for Speaker in order to go on to the House of Lords. The proper course has always been that the Speaker is put in the Lords, but, you know, if that's the way you want to play it, so be it. I'm not going to be intimidated by that, and I carried on making the right decisions for the remaining couple of weeks that I was in office. It is also the case, as is a matter of record, that a number of staff came forward and said that I had maltreated them, that I had bullied them. And I had a long-winded battle with the House over a number of cases, one of which I won and the others of which I lost. And we're talking about people coming forward from 2009 who had left, in some cases years before, saying, well, 11 years ago, Mr. Bercow shouted at me, or Mr. Bercow got cross with me about X. And I went through a very long-winded and tedious process, which wasn't a legal process. And in the end, you know, I lost those cases. Now, do I feel guilty about that? To be honest, I don't. I think that we all make mistakes in life, and we should be honest enough to say, I got that wrong, could have done better. But we are talking about a process that wouldn't have been heard in any court in the land, because courts have statutes of limitations for non-criminal matters. That is to say, something that goes back a certain period of time can't be brought before a court. Why? Well, because the evidence is too old, witnesses are missing, memories are flawed, etc. I was subject to a process that was not appealable in a court of law. To say that it was a kangaroo court, which is a description of a very unfair regulatory process, to say that it's a kangaroo court would be very unfair to kangaroos. It was a totally flawed process, utterly shambolic, totally amateurish, a complete stitch-up, and if it makes the people who waged that process feel better, good luck to them. I'm not going to apologise for what I didn't do. I had a huge number of massively loyal staff with whom I worked very closely for years, and I was elected and re-elected and re-elected and re-elected as Speaker 4 times. If I had been some raging bull of a character, constantly losing my temper with people and maltreating people, manifestly, I wouldn't have been elected and re-elected, re-elected, re-elected. The establishment had an axe to grind. They didn't like me. They were determined to stop me going to the Lords. And as I say, if that makes them feel better, good luck to them. I'm not going to let it spoil my life. Please.
So the three main parties, Labour, Conservative and Democrat, don't stand in the Speaker's seat.
Yep.
Do you think that this is undemocratic, and if not, what's your view on it?
And this is a very common question and a good question. The gentleman says the three main parties tend not to stand against the Speaker in his seat because the Speaker remains MP, but the Speaker sits as a kind of quasi-independent. And what the gentleman is saying to me is, given that at a general election, the Speaker stands as the Speaker seeking re-election to Parliament, but also by implication with a view to being re-elected to the chair. And so the major parties don't stand against the Speaker because the major parties don't want the Speaker to be defeated, and they don't want the Speaker to have to wage a party political campaign. And he's saying, is this undemocratic or democratic? Well, it's obviously not fully democratic. I mean, that is a fact. It's obviously not a fully democratic campaign. The difficulty is, I asked the House to look at this. The House was totally uninterested in changing the system. Totally uninterested. It was quite unpopular in Buckingham, where I nevertheless myself had a lot of support, but a lot of people said, well, we think it's very unfair that we don't have a full-scale election here because you're the Speaker. The House of Commons didn't want to change the system. The only thing I would say is twofold. First of all, could I still be active for constituents? Oh, and how? I had magnificent access to ministers. I could see any minister that I wanted, whenever I wanted, on behalf of a constituent, and frequently did. So the argument that, oh, well, the Speaker can't do anything for you is not true. The Speaker doesn't speak in debates, but the Speaker could contact any minister, including the Prime Minister, pretty much whenever he wanted to on behalf of constituents. So I certainly had access to the opportunity to represent people, and that was something that gradually constituents came to realise. It was reflected in me getting bigger and bigger majorities during my tenure as Speaker. in my local constituency. I suppose the other point that I would make is that you could say, well, all right, we'll take the Speaker out of the mix, we'll put him in a sort of rotten borough called St Stephen's, named after the entrance to the House, and let Buckingham have another election. But you then have a Speaker who was completely unelected by the public. The House wants to have a Speaker who shares some of the same experiences as other MPs. The House is choosy, if I'm honest about it. The House wants it both ways. It wants to have an elected MP as Speaker, but it doesn't want the risk of that person being over-politicised or defeated at the polls. Do I think it will change? No. And the reason I don't think it will change is that each seat will only have the Speaker every few thousand years. So there's no great pressure for the situation to change. It doesn't mean it's right, but will it change? It won't. I'll happily take one more.
Sorry, Steve, I think we're timed out.
We're timed out. Okay.
We have a round of applause.